Hi everyone, welcome back. It's now week 3, so we have finally finished chapter 1, and so we're moving on to chapter 2, which will look at sociological research methods. Moving into the research methods that sociologists use, it's important to understand that these research methods are based on the scientific approach or the scientific method. And that's a procedure for acquiring knowledge that emphasizes collecting data through observations and experiments. And the scientific method is usually taught in natural science classes like biology or chemistry, and so you've probably become familiar with this approach, but it's also important to know that it's the same procedure that social scientists use. And although natural scientists and social scientists study different things, both disciplines are scientific in that they collect data to analyze and understand the topic that interests them. So here are the steps of the scientific method. First, you'll identify a problem or ask a question, then you'll conduct a literature review, you'll form hypotheses and give operational definitions to variables, you'll choose a research method, you'll collect the data and analyze it, and then you will discuss the findings from your research. So this slide basically says the same thing that the previous slide did, it's just in word form instead of a chart. So the scientific method includes a literature review. It's important to determine what research has already been done, so you don't want to spend hours, weeks, or even months replicating someone else's project. And for this reason, you need to conduct a literature review. You also need to formulate your hypotheses or come up with a scientific guess about what it is that you expect to find. And then you determine what variables you want to study. For instance, if you want to look at test scores among 5th graders to see if eating breakfast improves performance, you'll have 2 variables, 5th graders taking a test and breakfast. Then you'll want to operationalize those variables or those definitions. So, for example, what is breakfast? Is it bacon and eggs, a piece of toast, a piece of candy? Operational definitions allow you to be more specific in examining your findings. Another aspect of the scientific method is distinguishing between correlation and causation. After reading all of your discussion posts, I've noticed that the majority of you guys and girls are psychology majors or nurse majors, and because of that, you're probably going to have to take the Statistics for Behavioral Sciences, which is a psychology course, and your psychology professors are going to tell you repeatedly over and over again, correlation does not equal causation. This will be imprinted on your brain by the time you are done with your 4 years of college. So correlation is a relationship between 2 variables. Just because something correlates, it does not mean that one variable causes the effect of the other variable. And then causation is a relationship in which one variable does cause another variable to change. And then spurious correlation is a relationship that seems to exist between 2 variables, but it's actually caused by some external or intervening variable. So let's take an example. In Florida, there are a lot of palm trees and a lot of senior citizens. You want to examine the relationship between the variables. The variables in this case are palm trees and senior citizens. You see that in states with fewer palm trees, there are fewer senior citizens, and in Florida, where there are many palm trees, there are many senior citizens. Therefore, there is a relationship between the variables. Palm trees and senior citizens are correlated. Again, they're not causal, so do palm trees cause senior citizens? Well, they don't. Do senior citizens cause palm trees? No. So it's not a causation, it's just correlation. And so you'll conduct a study, an experiment where you plant 100,000 palm trees in Ohio and you monitor the population. If you don't see a change in the number of senior citizens, in that case you can tell that palm trees aren't causing senior citizens. So we know there's a relationship, it's not causal, and you start to investigate further, and you realize that palm trees like warm weather. Senior citizens also like warm weather. So there's this third variable, which is temperature, that you didn't think of at the beginning. So in the end, this example is actually an example of a spurious correlation. There is a relationship between palm trees and senior citizens, but it's based on the fact that they both have a relationship with a third variable, which is temperature. Jumping into research methods, it's important to distinguish quantitative research from qualitative research. Quantitative research translates the social world into numbers that can be studied mathematically. So think of this as quantity or quantifying something. And then qualitative research uses non-numerical data like texts, interviews, photos, and recordings to help us understand social life. So it's important to note that within the social sciences, both of these types of research are valuable. Some researchers specialize in one type of research or the other, but many use both methods to triangulate their data or to make sure that their findings are consistent no matter what kind of research they do. A good example of quantitative research is the U.S. Census, which uses surveys to analyze data from across the country. And then a good example of qualitative research is Anne Frank's diary, which provides field notes based on her experiences and observations. So, which methods do we use? There are different ways to collect information about a topic, but each method has its own benefits and limitations. So when we begin our project, it's important to consider which method would work best for that project. Sometimes researchers will collect data using more than one method, which is called a mixed methods approach, and it actually is kind of useful because you'll be able to use various methods to formulate your answers, kind of like the triangulating part with qualitative and quantitative. So if your research shows the same trends when you use multiple kinds of methods, it increases the likelihood that your conclusions are actually correct. Okay, the first research method that I'll talk about is ethnography and the subset of ethnography, which is participant observation. One way to collect data is through ethnography, which includes studying people in their own environments in order to understand the meanings they give to their activities. The term ethnography literally means writing culture, which happens when researchers collect their observations and write about their experiences in a scientific way. So this is like taking field notes. And then in participant observation, the researcher both observes what's happening and they become a member in the social setting. So for instance, if you want to study college drinking behavior, one of the best ways to study these behaviors among college students might be to conduct an ethnographic study, where you go to bars in a college town or you go to college parties. In a sense, being at these parties gives you a bird's eye view into the inner workings of college parties, college drinking, and college social behavior. In this instance, it's an ethnographic study because the researcher is observing drinking behaviors among college students. The researcher can become a participant in this by drinking and fitting in with the party, and in that case it would become a participant observation type of research method. Ethnography usually happens in two steps. First, the researcher will observe a setting, and if they are using participant observation, then they'll also participate in the setting. Then the researcher will make a written account or field notes of what goes on there. Ethnographers aim to provide a thick description of the setting that they observe. It's important to take thorough and precise field notes when conducting an ethnographic study. Leaving something out because it doesn't seem important to you can result in incomplete data. Every detail is equally important, and recording those details properly allows the researcher to draw conclusions at the end of the study. So writing field notes can be very time-consuming, but it is also worthwhile. You'll have the opportunity to practice writing field notes when you complete your sociology experiment this semester. So now that we've talked about ethnography and the scientific method, it's important to note that they use different approaches. The scientific method generally uses a deductive approach, which means that we formulate a hypothesis first, and then we test the hypothesis to see whether it's accurate or not. Ethnographers, on the other hand, use the inductive approach, so they begin with specific observations, and then they form broad generalizations from them. So ethnographers look for patterns and themes that are revealed in their field notes. They start by immersing themselves in their field notes and fitting the data into categories such as episodes of conflict or common vocabulary shared by members. Identifying relationships among these categories then allows ethnographers to build theoretical propositions, which is a form of analysis known as grounded theory. Another research method are interviews. They involve direct face-to-face contact with respondents, and they can generate large amounts of qualitative data. So qualitative meaning it's non-numerical, it doesn't include mathematical equations. So interviews take a long time to complete, but they produce very rich data. In fact, in an interview, a respondent might say something that the researcher had not previously considered, which can help focus the research project. Researchers have to be careful not to lead the respondent into certain kinds of answers by asking questions like, "You really like eating vegetables, don't you?" Instead, researchers should allow the respondent to answer freely by asking questions like, "How do you feel about eating vegetables?" So there are two types of questions that interviews can have. There's open-ended questions and closed-ended questions. Open-ended questions let respondents take as much time as they need to answer the question, and they can talk as much as they'd like about the question you asked. So an example would be, what do you think about couples living together before they are married? The respondent can give lots of information, examples, and personal experiences, all of which could provide valuable data to the researcher. This method does take a lot of time, though, as responses can be lengthy. Closed-ended questions, on the other hand, give respondents a choice of answers. They impose a limit on the possible responses. For example, are you for or against couples living together before they are married? This question doesn't really have an option for a middle ground. Instead, respondents are forced to choose either yes or no. The third type of research method that I'll talk about are surveys, and they are questionnaires that are administered to a sample of respondents selected from a target population. So survey research tends to look at large-scale social patterns and employ statistics and other mathematical means of analysis. For this reason, surveys are quantitative in nature. Surveys are also relatively easy to create and to administer, but they are generally closed-ended, so you can't have a dialogue with the respondent in a survey. That means that answers will be direct and usually concise. It's easy to collect a lot of data this way, but the scope of responses will be limited. Researchers are increasingly using the internet for survey research rather than the traditional methods of in-person and mail surveys. So, your time here at OU will be spent with a lot of emails bombarding you, asking you to take surveys. And these are from students that have been in classes with you before. And they'll ask you to take their survey for their final research project or whatever they have to do that their teachers are asking them to do. This is a warning to you, but also just to note that it's a lot easier to send surveys through an email than it is to send them out in person or through the mail. The last research method that I'll talk about are experiments, and they are formal tests of specific variables and effects that are performed in a setting where all aspects of the situation can be controlled. Experiments are sometimes difficult to conduct in social settings because it's hard to control every aspect of a social situation, but they can help provide valuable insights into how a person might respond in certain situations. The experimental method involves both an experimental group and a control group. An experimental group includes participants that receive an experimental treatment or intervention. The control group, on the other hand, includes participants that continue without intervention, and they are compared to the experimental group. This method is actually used more in medicine than in social science. And so the experimental group will receive a drug treatment, and the control group will actually receive a placebo, which is a treatment that looks like that given to the experimental group, but actually has no effect. For instance, the control group might get a pill that looks like the experimental pill, but it's actually just a sugar pill, so it doesn't have any effect on the participant's health. And although this method is common in medicine, it is also used in social science to collect data. So today we've talked about different research methods. And it's also important to note that most sociologists believe that they should not allow their personal beliefs to influence their research. So we're examining the values of sociologists, and they really value objectivity. And so Max Weber coined the phrase value-free sociology to convey the idea that researchers should identify facts without allowing their own personal beliefs or biases to intervene in the process. And so value-free sociology is a helpful guideline because if you try to conduct a study and you think you already know what you're going to find, those suspicions might actually make you see what you're looking for, and makes you ignore other important facts in the data. As mentioned in the previous slide, sociologists value objectivity, and they also don't want to have their biases to impact their research. We also have the American Sociological Association, which has developed their own code of ethics to help researchers avoid bias and adhere to professional standards and to protect respondents from harm. It's always important to consider the outcome of your study. If you administer a drug, is there a possibility that someone could die? If you ask questions about sensitive childhood memories, will a respondent have a traumatic experience answering them? Adhering to the code of ethics helps you avoid situations that could potentially harm your respondents or yourself. Lastly, universities are where most of the research occurs, and so universities usually have an institutional review board or an IRB. The IRB consists of scholars within a university that reviews and approves their colleagues' research proposals and makes recommendations on how to protect human subjects. Anytime that you're conducting research, it's helpful to have input from other scholars. It helps ensure that your research is sound, that no one gets harmed, and that you're embarking on a project that will contribute to the existing literature. This pretty much concludes our audio lecture for Chapter 2. So what should you do now? You should finish reading Chapter 2 if you haven't already. You'll also need to complete the inquisitive quiz on Chapter 2, which is due this Sunday. We will not have a discussion post this week, so hopefully that will give you a breather on those. And then if you want to prepare for next week, you can start reading Chapter 3. I've given you another extra credit opportunity. This one is very similar to the syllabus quiz, except it's focused on participation. So it asks you questions like, now that you've learned about research methods, which seems to appeal to you more, qualitative or quantitative research? There will be 4 questions. Each question will be worth 1.5 points, so you could earn up to 6 extra credit points. To find this quiz, go to your Week 3 folder and click on EC Participation Questions Quiz. If you have any issues or troubles, please let me know via email. Have a great week, everyone.